Welcome to the channel. Many find it hard to fall asleep without a bedtime story. They want to feel a little chill in their chests. Who is visited by the strange shadow people and the hatman whom everyone fears? What are they? What sort of beings? The hatman collects the souls of those who peered into his hat. They say shadows are not simply an absence of light. Sometimes they watch, copy movements, and wait. There are creatures people call shadow people. One cannot catch them with a direct glance. If one looks too long, they become ordinary darkness. But from the corner of the eye, one sees them stir. Shadow people come where someone has lived alone for too long. They slip into rooms through windows, leave marks on walls, and sometimes sit down on the bed beside the sleeper. Their breathing cannot be heard, but the air grows colder, as if someone invisible exhales at the nape of one's neck. Among them there is one who is more terrifying than the rest. He is called the hatman. His silhouette is easy to recognize, a tall top hat and an elongated shadow longer than it should be. He appears in the most unexpected places, on the staircases of old houses, in dormitory corridors, at bedroom thresholds. No one hears him enter, but everyone feels his gaze. Those who have met the hatman tell the same story. He does not move at once. At first he stands motionless, as if checking whether he has been noticed. If one pretends not to see him, he leaves. But if gazes meet, the hatman slowly raises his hand and removes his hat. Inside there is no face. Only a void, bottomless and cold as a well. Those who peered into that darkness were never the same again. Sleep abandoned them, their reflections began to live independently, and sometimes they vanished entirely, dissolving into their own shadows. It is said that this is how new shadow people are born. At night, if a room is too quiet and a silhouette seems to flicker outside the window, it is better not to approach, especially if one thinks it was wearing a hat. His name was Nick. He had never believed in the supernatural. On the contrary, he always laughed at scary stories and urban legends. But in recent months he had grown afraid of his own window. His apartment was on the second floor of an old building. Opposite it stood another house that had been empty for years. Its residents had moved away and the building was awaiting demolition. Broken windows, dark doorways, collapsed balconies. Sometimes teenagers sneaked in to hang out, but mostly the place stood as a silent monument to the past. It began in winter. Nick noticed someone standing in a window across the way, on the third floor, almost directly opposite his apartment. At first he told himself it was his imagination, a lamp's shadow, an optical illusion, a trick of the light. But after a few days he saw the silhouette again, black, elongated, motionless. It stood right at the window, looking toward him. He kept convincing himself it was a coincidence, but a pattern emerged. Every night, close to midnight, it appeared. Sometimes a little earlier, sometimes later, but it was always there. He tried to see details, but it was pointless. Even through binoculars it was only a blurred shape, as if woven from thick darkness. No face, no clothes. And yet he felt its stare, cold, alien, persistent. One night he couldn't stand it and went to check. He went downstairs, out into the yard, and approached the abandoned house. The window panes were smashed and the doors boarded up, but inside it was silent. He shone his flashlight on that very window. Empty. No one. When he returned home and looked back from his apartment, his heart dropped. The figure was there again, in the exact same place. After that he stopped going near the window. But over time the figure began to appear not only at night. Sometimes during the day, while he drank coffee or worked at his computer, his gaze would slide to the window and the silhouette would be standing in the opposite opening. Once he noticed it move, barely. At first it seemed to tilt its head. Then, it raised an arm. And slowly waved at him. It terrified him. He recoiled from the window, almost dropping his cup. His heart pounded as if he had run a marathon. When he forced himself to look again, it was still there, arm raised, waiting. For several days he lived in complete darkness, draping blankets over the windows. Sleep would not come. He felt as though someone's gaze seeped through the fabric anyway. One night he woke with the sense that someone stood beside his bed. The room was dark, but his eyes adjusted, and he saw, on the wall near the wardrobe, a shadow. It belonged to no object, simply the silhouette of a human figure. He screamed, switched on the light, and the shadow vanished. From that night on, they began to come into the apartment. At first he saw them from the corner of his eye. Then he heard footsteps in empty rooms. Several times he woke because the mattress sagged, as if someone sat down beside him. The worst happened a week ago. He woke in the night again, not from footsteps or a shadow, but from a cold. Ice seemed to pour from the window. He turned his head slowly and saw it. The figure stood directly at his window. The window, however, was closed and 5 floors of open space separated them, yet it still stood there, weightless, pressed so close to the glass that only a few centimeters remained between them. For the first time he could make it out. It was a person, or something imitating a person, darker than night, faceless. But this time it wore a tall top hat. It did not move. It only stared. Then he heard a soft tapping on the glass, 3 times, as if it were asking to come in. He fled the apartment and has not wanted to return. He is also another witness. His name was Michael. He had been born in the USA, but a few years earlier he moved to Australia. Work and new horizons had seemed exciting. He rented a small house on the outskirts of Brisbane, a quiet place next to the woods. The first months were wonderful, warm nights, the cicadas' noise, a starry sky. But now he regretted coming at all. It began with small things. At first he noticed objects in the house shifting. Glasses left on the table would be found on the windowsill in the morning. A book he placed by the bed would end up in the kitchen. He blamed tiredness or forgetfulness. But one night he woke to a strange sound. At first he thought a thief was in the house. Light, cautious footsteps, as if someone did not want to be heard. He turned on the light. Silence. He checked the rooms empty. He was about to return to bed when he noticed something odd. On the wall beside the bedroom door there was a shadow. Clear, human-shaped. But there was nobody in the room, and the light source was behind him. He blinked and it disappeared. From then on it repeated. Sometimes the shadow moved a moment after he did. Sometimes it stood motionless in a corner. He tried to explain it away as fatigue or tricks of light, but his gut knew the truth: there was someone else in the house. A few weeks later the situation escalated. He began waking with the feeling that someone was sitting beside him. The mattress dipped beneath him and he distinctly heard soft breathing. But when he turned on the light, the bed was empty. He bought surveillance cameras and installed them around the house. On the first recording he saw something that made him tremble. At 3 a.m. a camera caught a dark figure flash down the hallway. It was taller than a person, elongated, completely black. For a fraction of a second it paused at his bedroom door and vanished. He showed the footage to his neighbor, John. John went pale and said, "Michael, you need to leave. Do you know how many shadow cases there have been here? This isn't a joke." Michael shrugged it off then. He didn't believe John. John, however, believed immediately. His family had their own stories of strange nights. He was frightened and urged Michael to go. Co-workers laughed, calling it stress and lack of sleep. Michael's mother tried to calm him at first, thinking he exaggerated, but after seeing the camera footage she grew alarmed and begged him to return to the States. Then one night changed everything. Michael woke to pressure on the mattress. He opened his eyes and saw it, the shadow. It sat at the head of the bed, bent over him. There was no face, only a void. Suddenly it leaned closer. He felt cold breath on his face. He screamed, switched on the light, and the figure disappeared. But a mark remained on the pillow, a distinct indentation, as if someone had been sitting beside him. Neighbor John started staying overnight sometimes to check the house, and installed a safety alarm. Some neighbors even began sticking warnings on windows. Do not approach at night. In the community the topic became a hushed taboo. The horror was passed along in whispered conversations over tea. Since that night they came every evening. Sometimes there were several. The shadows moved through rooms, stood by the walls, watched. Michael stopped sleeping. He only sat, listening to every rustle. Was his neighbor right? Should he leave? The previous night had been different. He noticed a silhouette at the door, but now it wore a tall top hat. It stood motionless, and he knew, these were not ordinary shadow people. It was him, the Hatman. Locals had told Michael about him. They said he was encountered in Australia more often than elsewhere. He came to those who lived too long near shadows, and when he appeared, everything ended. That day Michael packed his things and decided to leave. But from the corner of his eye he saw it again, motionless in the corner of the room, wearing a high hat. He was afraid to look directly. He knew that if their eyes met, it would be the end. His name was Jonathan. He had come to Australia from Texas in search of silence and solitude, to breathe new life, fresh air, open spaces, wild nature. He settled in a small house near the Gold Coast, almost on the very edge of a eucalyptus forest. By day the place seemed like paradise: tall trees, leaves whispering in the wind, crickets, and a constant chorus of birds he had never heard back home. The air smelled of damp earth and the salt of the ocean, which was less than an hour's walk away. But at night everything changed. The forest grew sullen and hostile. The cicadas fell silent as if on command, and a hush descended so deep it felt as though the ground itself were holding its breath. Branches stirred in the dark, and every rustle sounded like something enormous slipping past the window. At first he assumed it was animals. Australia was full of strange creatures, and he had been warned. Don't be alarmed if you hear something scraping the walls or walking on the roof. Soon, however, it became clear that what visited him at night had nothing to do with animals. The first thing he noticed was the shadows. They appeared where no movement should be, in the corner of the living room, elongated as if someone stood waiting, then in the bathroom mirror, behind his shoulder. Sometimes, passing a window, he would glimpse a silhouette inside the house though he was alone. These shadows were odd, they moved a little slower than he did, as if they copied him with a delay. Sometimes he would see a shadow raise an arm long after he had lowered his own. It drove him mad. Over time he began to feel their presence physically, the air in the room turned icy, breath caught in his throat. Sometimes the mattress sank at night as if someone had lain down beside him, and in those moments he heard breathing, not his own, heavy and cold, very close. One evening he stepped out onto the veranda. The sky was clouded, the moon hidden, and darkness blanketed the forest. Between the eucalyptus trees he noticed movement, first one darkening silhouette, then another. They did not approach, they simply stood and watched. He told himself it was an illusion, that his eyes were deceiving him. Then one of the silhouettes raised an arm, and he understood, they knew he could see them. The next day an elderly local named Harry came to him. Harry's face was grim and his eyes worried. The locals knew many things. Quietly he asked, "You've seen them, haven't you? The shadow people?" Jonathan nodded. "Then be ready. When they begin to show themselves openly, he will come." Naively Jonathan asked who would come. Harry crossed himself with an old Catholic gesture, though he had often said he no longer believed. "The Hatman. When he appears, run. But do not look him in the face. Never." The neighbor's warnings unsettled him. Harry believed what he'd seen and said such things had been witnessed long ago. Farmers treated the tales with cautious respect, the shadows were part of local folklore. Jonathan's father in Texas first told him angrily to leave, then asked for details. Worry replaced sarcasm quickly. That night Jonathan could not sleep. Every forest sound seemed menacing. At 2 a.m. he woke to a knock, 3 taps, dull, like knuckles on glass. He slowly looked toward the bedroom window and his heart stopped. There he stood, tall, thin, stretched out. His silhouette was blacker than the night itself, and on his head, a tall top hat. Impossible, unnatural, absorbing the light around it. He did not move, he only stared. Under the hat there was no face, only a void. Jonathan shut his eyes, hoping it was a dream. When he opened them again, the Hatman was already in the room. His shadow elongated along the wall, and he stepped out of it as though through a doorway. The Hatman stood 3 paces from the bed. Jonathan could not move, his body was paralyzed. He only heard his own ragged breathing. The darkness in the room seemed to pull toward him. Then the Hatman slowly raised his hand to his hat. Jonathan remembered Harry's words and turned his face away, squeezing his eyelids so tightly they ached. He did not see what the Hatman did next. In that moment he heard not a sound but emptiness, a true, muffled void as if the world around him vanished. When he opened his eyes, the Hatman was gone. 3 days have passed since. He does not sleep, does not eat, he spends his time watching the corners. The shadows are everywhere now, in mirrors, on the floor, in doorways. They move freely, like owners of the house. The previous night Jonathan heard the 3 knocks at the window again, but this time he did not dare turn away. When he looked, the Hatman had lifted his hat. Jonathan cannot say what he saw, he cannot put it into words. He knows only one thing, it was the end. His reflection in the mirror no longer mimics him, it smiles when he cries and stands when he sits. Caught between the strangeness and the local superstitions on one side and his family's disbelief on the other, Jonathan withdrew. He called home less, his parents grew seriously worried. Her name was Emily Harper. She hadn't come to Australia as a tourist but as someone who listened to other people's fears and collected them piece by piece. Back in the US she had been interested in rare legends and nocturnal phenomena. People sent her audio recordings, letters, photos, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence. When reports about shadow people and a certain figure in a hat called the Hatman began to arrive in a couple of packages, she at first thought people were just chasing a hype. Then messages about Australian cases reached her, and she boarded a plane. She arrived at dawn. The sea carried the taste of salt and the whisper of waves, but a strip of eucalyptus ran along the shoreline and their scent, sharp, bitter, split her between memory of home and a warning. Local roads were narrow, with patches of fog low in the hollows. The sun hung high but seemed reluctant to break through the humidity. She rented a small cottage on the outskirts, not far from where Jonathan and, later, Michael lived, if the letters were to be believed. They did not know each other, yet their accounts wove into a single thread: the same window, the same knock, the same top hat, the same whispers. Her first nights passed relatively quietly. But even in relative calm there was the other, that which lives between sounds. Night stretched unusually slowly. The cicadas set a rhythm and then fell silent, as if someone had cut their string. Sometimes wind stole onto the veranda and rustled dry leaves so that it sounded like someone walking between the trees, light as if not touching the ground. She set her recorder on the kitchen table, turned on the light and listened again to Jonathan's and Michael's tapes, whispers off camera, stammers, long pauses. She wanted to remind herself. Their voices trembled in different ways. Jonathan was in shock, Michael tense all the time, but both shared a detail: the fear had become so dense it nearly smelled like metal and old paper. She made notes and decided that if the Hatman existed beyond myth, there was more than stray darkness behind him. There was a rule, a logic, or something people called a bargain. She thought and waited to see if she would witness anything. The first contact did not happen at once. He did not arrive as a blurred silhouette at a window, he came as a whisper. It began with a neighbor's dog. At midnight it howled and then abruptly fell silent. She stepped onto the porch, fog drew low to the ground like a blanket, and at the far end of the country lane there was a dark column of air, not a tree, not a pole, just concentrated blackness. Emily felt the hairs on her arms stand up. At that instant someone or something whispered her name. It was almost a breath sound, not a voice but the impression of a voice inside the teeth. She switched on her torch and the beam ripped through the fog, tearing it into silver threads. But there was nothing to see. On the third day she found an old newspaper wrapped in plastic under the porch, a gift, perhaps, left by the previous tenant. Inside the paper was an item about a young woman who had disappeared about 12 years earlier. The photograph showed a sunny, smiling woman. There was a caption, but the name and date were gone, leaving only blurred shadows. In the margin, someone, an unknown hand, had scrawled, "Don't look in the hat." Emily then met the neighbor Harry, the elderly man who had warned Jonathan. He sat on his veranda across the road, drinking tea, smoking, his face hardly wrinkled. His eyes were quiet as if he could see farther than her steps could reach. When Emily mentioned the paper, he leaned forward. "Everything begins quietly, Emily. First the whispers. Then the windows. Then him." "Who, him?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The one who takes off his hat, Harry said. The one whose inside is dark, who gathers those who looked at him or into the hat. You understand, it isn't always a person. Sometimes it's an order the shadows keep. Sometimes it's a lapse in memory. Sometimes it's eyes that were too curious. His words sounded like a verdict. Emily stepped back. Don't look in the hat, she thought, and the smile that had once been a tool began to feel like shackles. The night that changed everything was starless, the moon was wholly hidden. The room smelled of damp wood and the coffee she had not finished. She could not sleep, her recorders were on and a camera pointed at the window. She sat cross-legged and wrote in her notebook, "If someone comes, do not look." She rehearsed it like medicine. At 2 in the morning she heard the knock, 3 dull taps on the glass, like old knuckles on wood. Time seemed to compress, the air thickened. She approached the window slowly, the floorboards creaked as if warning each step. Her heart drummed in her ears like a ritual percussion. There, in the corner of the street beyond the lamplight, he stood, tall, in a top hat, his silhouette nearly merging with the blackness of the night. The hat itself showed as if cut out against non-existence. He stood motionless. She knew any backward step would not save her, he knew where she stood. He knew when someone watched. She felt the whisper close now, not in her ears but somewhere within her chest. His voice said goodbye in a tongue almost familiar but horribly distorted. The whisper listed names of people she recognized from letters and stories, and then her name. She turned away, closed her eyes. Her breathing became ragged. There is an ancient instinct not to look at the thing one fears most. She began to count to 50 as if numbers could protect her. The count was interrupted by another thought: what if he did not only collect those who looked at him, but those he forced to look? What if the whispers drew the gaze toward the hat, and the hat was a trap? She opened her eyes. He stood closer, the hat no longer seemed an object but a whole-swallowing light. He raised his hand and doffed his hat in a theatrical bow. Inside there was no face. Not mere emptiness, but an inner night, dense and alive, like an ocean without shores. She felt her mind begin to fall in, as if pulled by a magnet. She recoiled and dropped her notebook, pages scattered across the floor like late leaves. The whispers rose and seemed to cheer her on like an audience. Then she heard a voice not his but from within, softly urging, "Look." That outer voice was a mirror that amplified the pull. She wanted to run. She did not think, she only knew the cost was unknown and that one must neither look into the hat nor heed its call. She fled the house without a jacket, without her phone. Cold bit her lungs as she ran down the lane. Behind her the world seemed to crumble, shadows stretching along the edges of houses like adults suddenly waking. She paused briefly by a wooden fence, covered her face with her hands and listened. Silence changed to wind whispers that carried familiar phrases: "She's gone, he stayed, we wait." They were the voices of the disappeared, not pleading, not cursing, but pointing the way like the dead who knew where a treasure was hidden. In the morning Harry and 2 other neighbors found her. She sat at the roadside trembling, a grazed knee and a ruined notebook. She tried to explain. He took off his hat. "I saw." They looked at one another, and Harry put a hand on her shoulder in a different way than before, not as someone saying, "Be careful," but as someone saying, "I'm sorry." "You're not the only one," Harry whispered. "We have lost many. It's the curse of this place." But you know what's worse? He paused as if choosing words. There is never just one. When the Hatman comes, he doesn't just carry people off, he leaves marks. The shadows learn. They repeat. They wait for the next who cannot resist. At night, Emily had heard whispers before, even in safe city hotels. They crept in like damp dreams. She had told ghost stories, but more than that, she spoke of emptiness, the kind that bought voices and names. People called her, wrote to her, one claimed, "My husband came back different," another, "My child speaks to the shadow under the bed." The reports multiplied, and each one carried the same small window of fear. But the hat was different. The hat made the shadow into a master. Emily thought she could trace patterns. What if the Hatman was only a metaphor, trauma, a collapse of memory? What if those who vanished didn't disappear but became another layer of the shadow, thickening it, until perhaps the Hatman himself dissolved into its density? But scientific language never warned those who had seen emptiness invade familiar objects, a mirror, a teapot, a puddle. 2 weeks later, Emily returned to the house where it had all begun. Inside, silence. Dust and leaves covered the floor. The fireplace long cold. On the table lay her notebook, neatly folded, its pages blank, as though someone had cut out the words. On the mirror, a dark circular mark like the press of a hat. Emily touched it, and her palm carried away not just chill but the distinct sensation, described by so many others, of someone else moving inside her own skin. She set her recorder down and spoke aloud, "I know who you are." The whisper came at once, as if rising from under moss. "We know what you call us." Whispers were not mere wind. They clung to names. They learned how to summon a glance. They wore disguises, loneliness, curiosity, regret. They spoke the words one longed most to hear. And the Hatman was the point where whispers converged into a single voice. He came not for the rare witness, but for those who listened too long. Those who could not stop. Visions were not something one could simply shed. Legends had their own taste. They resisted being torn apart. They grew, passing from one story to the next, from one night to another, spreading like fog across a field. The last night Emily spent in Australia was clear. Moonlight thinned the darkness, the shadows no longer seemed as deep. She stood at her window and heard a distant knocking, 3 times, from a neighboring settlement. She wondered, who this time? A stray thought crept in, maybe someone else has seen him again. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft as breath. "Emily." She did not answer. She shut the windows, slipped on headphones hissing white noise, and left her recorder running not as proof but as a thread for memory. And still, if you hear these stories, if you live in a house where one window looks into another, if you hear the faintest knock at midnight, remember, do not approach, do not look, do not answer. Otherwise the dark begins to learn from you. The Hatman keeps collecting names. And he is not alone. He is only the one who removes the hat. The whispers are everywhere. Do not let your name become a sound they grow used to repeating. Do all believe the stories? At first, some residents doubted. Then they confessed to their own encounters. Soon a small wave of complaints and police calls spread through the district. Neighbors became either guardians or kept their distance, terrified of drawing the shadows closer. The police gave official replies: "There is no clear evidence, insisting no crime had been found though reports and recordings piled up. Old-timers began gathering, trading methods in hushed tones, how not to look. The faithful, the middle-aged, the elderly. Those who had lived longest in the area, added their own family marks to the tale, prayers, charms, taboos. Some families split apart when one member had seen the shadow, suddenly a stranger to the rest, feared for his reflection. Other households grew tighter, bound in silence and shared defense. And everyone knew, they were tied now by one secret. And no lock on any door could save them if the Hatman had already chosen their town.